story for you. Developers are working to build a CO2 pipeline across Iowa. So it's basically an environmental move, but not everyone is on board.
Now, 6 News' Joe Harris tells us where the pipeline project stands in Pottawattamie County and what still needs to happen for it to become a reality.
More than 30 ethanol facilities in the upper Midwest.
Pipeline developer Summit Carbon Solutions wants to build one of these through Pottawattamie County, a carbon dioxide pipeline that would carry liquid CO2 through Iowa, part of a bigger plan to include 4 other states delivering the liquid from ethanol plants to underground storage locations in North Dakota and Illinois.
Parcel that's landlocked that has an easement.
Part of the Pottawattamie County Board of Supervisors hearing this week concerned a contract with inspection firm ISG Inc. to monitor the pipeline project should it go through.
We are there to watch and ensure that the contractors are following the Iowa code requirements and to minimize any long-term effects that the construction may have on the agricultural land.
In a statement to WOWT 6 News, Summit says it's acquired voluntary easements of private property in Pottawattamie County for 90% of the pipeline's planned route. The possibility of using eminent domain to get the rest of the land to make it happen has come up. Eminent domain is the government's power to take private property and convert it into public use with compensation to the property owners. Last August, the Board of Supervisors unanimously declared its opposition to using that for constructing such a pipeline.
I have no problems with property owners doing what they want to do with their own private property. What I have an issue with is forcing private property owners to do things that they don't.
Jorgensen believes if eminent domain is used, more companies will try to use it for other projects. He also fears a scenario like the one in Satarsha, Mississippi in 2020. Around 45 people were hospitalized after being gassed in their homes and nearby vehicles because of a ruptured CO2 pipeline.
We don't need those kinds of incidences here in Pottawattamie County, especially if we're looking to attract people into our county. Businesses, corporate headquarters, tourist trade. We don't need that kind of incident to happen.
6 News asked Summit for its comments on that event, as well as the use of eminent domain to build the pipeline, but received no answer. On your side in Pottawattamie County, Iowa, Joe Harris, 6 News.
Summit Carbon Solutions says if the pipeline is built, the company would annually pay $880,000 in property taxes in Pottawattamie County.